Welcome, listeners, to a tale carved not in stone, but in silence. A mystery whispered on the winds of the deep, past the shattered palaces of empires that once thought themselves eternal. This is the story of a shadow that fell across the ancient world, a storm of men and ships that emerged from the unknown, shattered kingdoms, and then vanished, leaving behind only ruins and a single, haunting question. Who were the Sea Peoples? Gather close, for we are about to sail into the heart of history's greatest enigma. If this journey into the lost worlds captures your imagination, you can delve deeper into other forgotten truths by subscribing to our channel, Historical Truth. We have many more stories to share. The Late Bronze Age was a world of glittering, interconnected empires. Around 1200 BC, the Mediterranean was not a sea of divided nations, but a bustling highway of commerce and diplomacy, linking the gold-rich pharaohs of Egypt, the mighty Hittite lords of Anatolia, the merchant princes of Ugarit, and the Wanaks, the great kings of Mycenaean Greece. Their correspondence, etched on clay tablets in a diplomatic language known as Akkadian, speaks of royal gifts, marriage alliances, and the exchange of vital resources: copper from Cyprus, tin from afar to forge bronze, ivory from Canaan, and glass from Egypt. It was a cosmopolitan age, a globalized system that seemed unshakable in its sophistication and power. Yet, within a single generation, this entire world collapsed. The grand palaces were burned to the ground, never to be rebuilt. The intricate trade networks disintegrated, literacy vanished in many regions, and a dark age descended, a twilight that would last for centuries. The catalyst for this cataclysm, according to the few surviving records, was a relentless, faceless enemy from the sea. Our most vivid window into this chaos comes from the one civilization that managed to survive, though battered and forever changed: Egypt. On the walls of the mortuary temple of Pharaoh Ramesses III at Medinet, Habu, a dramatic story is carved in stone and hieroglyphs. The inscriptions speak of a dire crisis. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. No land could stand before their arms. It describes a coordinated movement of disparate peoples, a horde on the move, not just as warriors, but as entire nations migrating with their families and possessions in ox-drawn carts. They came by land and by sea, a pincer movement that threatened to strangle the very heart of the civilized world. The reliefs depict a great naval battle, a chaotic melee in the Nile Delta. Egyptian galleys, sleek and ordered, ram and board the vessels of the enemy. The enemy ships are different, with high, bird-headed prows and sterns. The warriors are shown with distinctive feathered headdresses and round shields, fighting with thrusting spears and long, straight swords. The inscriptions claim a glorious victory for Ramesses, a salvation of Egypt from the abyss. But the victory, if as total as proclaimed, was Pyrrhic. The cost was immense. Egypt, though it retained its sovereignty, lost its empire in Canaan and soon plunged into an era of economic decline and political fragmentation. The world it had known was gone. But who were these attackers? The Egyptians did not call them a single name. They listed them as separate groups: the Peliset, the Checker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and the Weshesh, among others. These are the names that echo through history, the identifiers we cling to. The Peliset are almost universally agreed to be the Philistines, who later settled on the coast of Canaan and gave their name to the land of Palestine. The others remain shrouded in guesswork. Were the Shekelesh from Sicily, the Danaan from mainland Greece, or perhaps the island of Rhodes? The evidence is circumstantial, a puzzle with most of the pieces missing. The scale of the destruction they are implicated in is staggering. In Anatolia, the mighty Hittite Empire, a rival to Egypt for centuries, simply ceased to exist. Its capital, Hattusa, a massive fortified city, was not merely sacked, but systematically destroyed and abandoned. The palace archives, a final record, were baked in the ensuing fire, preserving the last desperate moments of the kingdom. To the south, the wealthy trading city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast met a similar fate. A tablet found in its ruins, a letter from the king, speaks of the enemy's approach and a desperate, unheeded plea for help. "The enemy ships are already here," it reads. "They have set fire to my towns and have done very great damage in the country." It is the last message ever sent from that great city. It paints a picture of a world caught completely by surprise, its lines of communication and mutual defense snapping under an overwhelming and unforeseen force. The silence that followed the storm is, in many ways, as deafening as the cataclysm itself. To understand the true impact of the Sea Peoples, one must walk through the ghost cities they left behind. Let us journey inland from the coast to the heart of the Hittite Empire. Hattusa was not a simple town. It was a monumental capital, a city of grand temples and cyclopean walls that sprawled across a rocky plateau. Its granaries could feed tens of thousands. Its archives held the legal and diplomatic wisdom of an age. Today it is a field of ruins, its stones scorched black. Archaeologists who pick through the layers of Hattusa find a story of abrupt and violent end. There was no slow decline. The city was put to the torch in a single, devastating event. But here lies the first twist in our mystery. The attackers left no trace of themselves. No new pottery styles appear in the ashes. No distinctive weapons of the Sea Peoples are found among the fallen. It is as if a whirlwind of pure destruction passed through, leaving nothing but embers and bones. The Hittite kingdom, which had held sway over Anatolia for half a stuffed millennium, fragmented into tiny, insignificant Neo-Hittite principalities, a pale shadow of its former glory. A similar story unfolds hundreds of miles to the west, in the citadels of the Mycenaean Greeks. The great palaces of Pylos, Mycenae, and Tiryns, centers of the heroic world sung of by Homer, were all destroyed by fire around the same time. At Pylos, clay tablets baked in the Inferno record, in the linear B script, the final, mundane preparations for its defense. They speak of rowers being sent to the coast, of watchers being posted. They are the administrative records of a kingdom going through the motions of a threat it did not fully comprehend, right up until the moment its world ended. The complex bureaucracy that these tablets represent vanished entirely from Greece for centuries. The art of writing was lost. This pattern of collapse was not uniform, and this is crucial. It was not a single, coordinated invasion sweeping all before it like a tidal wave. It was a systemic failure, a cascade. Some cities were destroyed and never reoccupied. Others, like the great port of Ugarit, were so thoroughly annihilated that only a small village ever returned to the site. But then, there are the curious cases of survival and transformation. The city of Byblos, further south along the coast, weathered the storm. Why? Was it luck, geography, or diplomacy? And then, there is the evidence from the sea itself. Underwater archaeology off the coast of modern Turkey and Israel has begun to reveal a fascinating picture. A shipwreck discovered at Cape Gelidonia, and a more famous one at Uluburun, are time capsules from this vibrant late Bronze Age world. The Uluburun ship was a veritable floating palace, carrying cargo from a dozen different cultures: copper ingots from Cyprus, ebony and ivory from Africa, tin from an unknown source, glass from Mesopotamia, and personal effects from Canaanite and Mycenaean merchants. It shows a world intimately connected. Its sinking around 1300 BC is a prelude. It shows what was at stake, the wealth that was coursing through these trade routes. The collapse of this system was an economic catastrophe on an unimaginable scale. The Sea Peoples did not just attack kingdoms. They severed the very arteries of commerce and communication that held the age together. So we are left with the charred ruins, the sunken ships, and the silent baked clay tablets. The traditional image is of a horde of ruthless seafaring barbarians, destroying for destruction's sake. But modern historians and archaeologists are beginning to ask more complex and perhaps more disturbing questions. What if the Sea Peoples were not the cause of the collapse, but a symptom of it? What if they were not the disease, but a fever? The evidence points to a world already under immense strain. Climate data from tree rings and lake sediments suggests a period of severe, prolonged drought and cooling around this time. Crop failures, famine, and the mass. Migration of desperate populations would have been the inevitable result. Were the Sea Peoples the first climate refugees on a civilization-ending scale? The theory of a climate-driven catastrophe offers a compelling, if chilling, backdrop to our mystery. Imagine the scene not on the battle-scarred coasts, but deep inland, in the arid highlands and once fertile plains far from the Great Sea. Years of failing rains. The earth, once rich and dark, turns to pale, cracked dust. Rivers that have nourished civilizations for centuries shrink to pathetic trickles. The grain in the royal storehouses, meant to see the people through a single lean season, is stretched over 3, then 4. Famine is no longer a specter, it is a resident in every village. This is not mere speculation. Ice cores from Greenland and sediment layers from Turkish lakes tell a story of a sharp, global climatic shift in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC. A period of sustained drought and cooling, now often called the 3.2 kilo-year event, gripped the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. For empires built on agricultural surplus and the taxing of that surplus to support armies, bureaucrats, and cities, this was an existential threat. A king might command 10,000 chariots, but he could not command the clouds. In such a world, the delicate web of international diplomacy and trade would have frayed to breaking point. A Hittite king, in a desperate letter found in the ruins of Ugarit, pleads with the king of Egypt, "My brother, there is no grain in my lands." He begs for a shipment to stave off starvation. This is the Hittite Empire, a superpower of the age, brought to its knees not by swords, but by empty granaries. What happens when the central authority can no longer feed its people? It loses its legitimacy. It loses its control. This is where our sea peoples may truly begin to form. They were likely not a single people at all, but a complex amalgam, a desperate confederation of uprooted populations. Imagine displaced farmers from arid Anatolia, their villages abandoned to the dust. Add to them landless laborers from faltering Mycenaean city-states, their palaces unable to provide. Mix in perhaps opportunistic groups from the less stable regions of Italy, Sardinia, or Sicily, seeing a chance for plunder in the wider world's weakness. They were a snowball rolling downhill, gathering mass and momentum. As they moved, they would have displaced other groups, forcing them to join the chaotic migration or be destroyed by it. They became a self-perpetuating crisis. Their mode of travel, described by the Egyptians as coming by both land and sea, supports this. The naval arm, the one that attacks Egypt and coastal cities, would have been composed of the seasoned mariners and pirates among them, the ones who gave them their name. But the land arm, with its ox carts carrying women, children, and all worldly possessions, speaks not of a raiding party, but of a people on the move, a migration. They were not just attacking to plunder, they were searching for a new home, for land that was still green, for a place safe from the drought and collapse that had consumed their old worlds. This reframes their attacks on the great empires not as mindless barbarism, but as acts of desperate survival. The fortified cities of the coast, with their stockpiled grain and secure wells, would have been beacons of hope and reservoirs of resources for this hungry horde. To sack a Ugarit or a Hattusa was not just a military victory, it was a means of replenishment. They were fighting a war of survival against civilizations that were already in their death throes, finishing off kingdoms that the climate had already doomed. The irony is profound. The very empires they shattered may have been collapsing from within, and the Sea Peoples were merely the external force that gave the final, decisive push. This paints a far more complex and tragic picture than the simple barbarian horde. It suggests a feedback loop of collapse. Climate stress leads to famine, which weakens empires, which leads to internal unrest and migration, which then overwhelms the weakened systems, causing total systemic failure. The Sea Peoples were both a product of this cycle and its most visible agent. This new perspective forces us to look closer at the victims themselves. The great empires of the Bronze Age were magnificent, but they were also rigid, top-heavy structures. Their economies were centralized in the palaces, their militaries reliant on expensive, complex technology like the chariot. When the climate shifted and the rains failed, this rigidity became a fatal flaw. A decentralized nomadic society could simply move. A vast empire, tied to its grain-producing heartlands and its bureaucratic centers, could not. Consider the chariot, the ultimate symbol of Bronze Age military might. A single chariot required 2 highly trained soldiers, a driver and an archer or spearman, a team of specially bred horses, a skilled craftsman to build and maintain the lightweight vehicle, and a steady supply of leather, wood, and metal. It was the equivalent of a modern main battle tank, incredibly powerful on the right terrain, but also a massive logistical drain. Now, imagine an empire facing famine. The horses starve. The craftsmen, unpaid in grain, abandon their workshops. The intricate supply chain for spare parts shatters. The mighty chariot corps, the backbone of the army, is immobilized not by enemy action, but by systemic collapse. This is the crumbling wall that the Sea Peoples encountered. Their forces, as depicted by the Egyptians, were primarily infantry. They fought with long swords and javelins, weapons that were cheaper to produce and required less specialized training. They were more flexible, more adaptable. They did not rely on a vast, centralized infrastructure to sustain their way of war. In a world falling apart, their simpler, more brutal methods were far more effective. They were a fluid enemy attacking a brittle one. The chaos of the era is perfectly encapsulated in a single, poignant artifact, the so-called urgent letter from Ugarit. Found in the city's kiln, baked and preserved by the very fire that destroyed the city, it was a desperate message from the king of Ugarit, Amurapi, to the governor of Alashia, Cyprus. He writes, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came, my cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Luca? Thus, the country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it. The 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us." This letter is a scream into a void. It reveals a kingdom caught completely off guard, its army and fleet deployed elsewhere, perhaps at the request of its Hittite overlords who were facing their own apocalyptic struggle. Ugarit, one of the great maritime powers of the age, had been left defenseless. The enemy did not need a vast armada. 7 ships were enough to deliver the killing blow to a giant. This was not a war of set-piece battles between organized armies. It was death by 1,000 cuts, a collapse of the very system of mutual defense that was supposed to hold the civilized world together. The plea for help was sent, but the help never came. The system was already broken. So, as we picture the Sea People's ships making landfall on a vulnerable coast, we must also picture the empty chariot garages, the deserted watchtowers, and the silent palaces of the kings who once commanded continents. The raiders from the sea did not just bring destruction. They exposed a fragility that was already there. They were the spark that landed in a tinderbox of drought, famine, and political decay. The explosion that followed consumed everyone, attackers and defenders alike, in a common conflagration. Yet, history is rarely a story of pure annihilation. Even the most devastating fires leave behind embers, and from these embers, new worlds are kindled. The great mystery of the Sea Peoples does not end with the burning of cities. It continues in the strange and uneven silence that followed, and in the puzzling new societies that emerged from the ashes. To understand their full impact, we must look not only at what they destroyed, but at what they built. The most compelling evidence comes from the very land that claims to have defeated them, Egypt. While Pharaoh Ramesses III proclaimed a great victory, saving Egypt from the invaders, the aftermath tells a more nuanced story. The Egypt that emerged from the crisis was a shadow of its former self. Its control over Canaan was lost forever, its economy shattered, its central authority weakened. The glory days of the empire were over. But on the very coasts they supposedly defended, something new appeared. The Egyptian record's name? All specific tribes among the Sea Peoples, and one of them, the Peliset, is singled out. In the decades following the battles, these same Peliset appear in the archaeological record of southern Canaan, not as raiders, but as settlers. They established a confederation of 5 powerful cities: Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza. Their material culture is distinct from the Canaanite settlements that preceded them. They introduced new styles of pottery, a sophisticated locally produced pottery known as Philistine bichrome ware, decorated with red and black geometric and avian motifs. Their diet, revealed by bone analysis and refuse piles, included a taste for pork and dogs, habits that set them apart from their neighbors. This is the birth of the Philistines, a people who would become the legendary adversaries of the Israelites. Their story immortalized in the Hebrew Bible, with tales of Samson and Delilah, David and Goliath. The Philistines were not mere destroyers, they were survivors and adapters. They took the best land on the coastal plain, assimilated local Canaanite elements, and forged a powerful, lasting cultural identity. They were, in a very real sense, the most successful of the Sea Peoples, the ones who found a new home and made it their own. But what of the others? The Checker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen? Their fates are far more obscure, lost to the very dark age they helped create. Some scholars, piecing together fragmentary evidence, suggest that the Checker may have settled further north, around the city of Dor. The Danaan have been tenuously linked to the Greek Danaoi of Homer's epics, or to the tribe of Dan from the Bible, who were said to have a seafaring past. The Shekelesh gave their name to Sicily, but whether they came from there or settled there after the collapse is a question that may never be answered. This is the ultimate frustration and fascination of the Sea Peoples. They appear on the stage of history with terrifying suddenness, play a leading role in the greatest collapse of the ancient world, and then, for the most part, they vanish back into the mists from which they came. They left no great inscriptions praising their own deeds, no royal tombs filled with treasure. Their story is told almost entirely by their victims. We see them only in the terrified eyes of those who face them, and in the new cultural landscapes that emerge in the vacuum they created. The world that was born from the ruins of the Bronze Age was a different one. The great centralized palace economies were gone. In their place arose smaller, more nimble kingdoms and city-states, like those of the Israelites, the Phoenicians, and the Philistines. The age of international diplomacy in Akkadian was over. The Iron Age had begun, a harder, more diffuse, and in many ways, more resilient world. The Sea Peoples, intentionally or not, had not merely ended an era, they had been the midwives to a new one. The silence of the victors is one of history's most profound puzzles. If the Sea Peoples were indeed such a transformative force, why do we not hear their own voice? The answer lies in the nature of the dark age they helped usher in. The collapse was not merely political or economic, it was a cognitive rupture. The intricate bureaucracies that kept records, the scribal schools that taught the complex cuneiform and linear B scripts, the very practice of literacy itself, these were luxuries of a stable, surplus-producing society. When that society crumbled, so too did its memory. For the common person living through those times, the world must have seemed to be ending. The great kings who were seen as intermediaries with the gods had failed. The trade routes that brought tin for bronze, the essential metal for tools and weapons, evaporated. The knowledge of how to build in ashlar masonry, to construct vast drainage systems, to plan palatial complexes, all this was lost within a generation or two. It was a return to a more local, more precarious existence. In such a world, there was no one to write the epic of the Sea Peoples from their perspective. Their story became a cautionary tale told by the survivors, a ghost story of the civilized world. This leads us to the most speculative and tantalizing question. Could the memory of this great cataclysm have survived, distorted and mythologized in the foundational stories of the civilizations that came after? Many scholars believe so. The Greek poet Hesiod, writing centuries later, spoke of a lost age of heroes, a time of mighty men and great deeds that ended in violence and chaos. Could this be a folk memory of the Mycenaean world and its collapse? More strikingly, the great epic poems of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are set in this twilight period. While they tell of a war against Troy, they are filled with themes of wandering, piracy, and the sack of cities, the very essence of the Sea Peoples era. Is the story of Odysseus, the man of twists and turns, who raids the Nile Delta and wanders the sea for 10 years, a fragmented echo of a much larger historical narrative of maritime disruption. Even the Hebrew Bible, compiled long after the events, contains intriguing echoes. The Philistines, a very real and persistent threat to the Israelites, are portrayed as a powerful, technologically advanced people from across the sea. The uncircumcised Philistines, with their monopoly on ironworking and their fearsome champions like Goliath. Their origins in the Great Upheaval were likely forgotten by the biblical writers, but their foreignness and their seaborne origins remained a central part of their identity in the cultural memory of the region. This transmutation of history into myth is perhaps the final, fitting chapter for the Sea Peoples. They ceased to be a people of flesh and blood and became a symbol. They became the ultimate agent of divine retribution, the unknowable foe, the consequence of cosmic imbalance. In Egyptian propaganda, they were the chaos that the pharaoh, as the upholder of divine order, Ma'at, was destined to defeat. In the later classical and biblical traditions, they became archetypal villains, a narrative shorthand for a destructive external force. And so, we are left circling the central, unanswerable void. We have the Egyptian reliefs, the burned cities, the refugee pottery, and the silence. We have a name for a phenomenon, but not a true understanding of the people who bore it. They were likely a perfect storm of climate refugees, economic migrants, and opportunistic warriors, a symptom of a world pushed past its breaking point. Their legacy is the world they destroyed, and the new one they inadvertently created. A world without the Hittites, with a weakened Egypt, and with the rising powers of the Levant, who would eventually shape the course of Western history. The mystery of the Sea Peoples endures not because we have no answers, but because the answers we have are so fragmentary and so deeply intertwined with the birth of our own historical era. They are the ghost in the machine of antiquity, a reminder that even the most solid and seemingly permanent of civilizations are fragile, and that the tides of history can be risen by forces as simple and as complex as a failed harvest and a desperate search for home. And so, we stand on the shore, looking out at the same sea that bore them. The waves that once carried their bird-proud ships now crash indifferently on coasts that have long since forgotten their names. The mystery of the Sea Peoples is, in the end, a mirror. We see in them what we fear most, the sudden, inexplicable end of our own world. They are the embodiment of the collapse that waits in the wings of every golden age, a reminder that the intricate networks of trade, diplomacy, and power that we build can be undone by forces we neither see nor understand. Perhaps the most haunting lesson is not who they were, but what their story reveals about the nature of history itself. The grand narratives we construct, of kings and empires, of progress and destiny, are fragile things. They can be erased in a generation, their records burned, their languages forgotten, their very existence reduced to a handful of names on a victor's monument. The Sea Peoples remind us that history is written not only by the victors, but more often by the survivors. And in a collapse of such magnitude, there are very few survivors left to tell the whole story. The open ending of their tale is, therefore, the only ending it could have. There is no final battle where their great king is slain, no treaty that defines their borders, no tomb that reveals their origins. There is only a before and an after, a before of glittering palaces, international letters, and a connected Mediterranean world, and an after of silence, ash, and a slow, painful rebirth in a new age of iron. The question, who were the Sea Peoples, may never be conclusively answered. They have retreated from history into the realm of legend, a swirling confluence of desperate migrants, ambitious warriors, and starved refugees caught in a cataclysm not entirely of their own making. They were both the destroyers and the destroyed, the architects of a new world who vanished into the foundations they helped lay. As the last embers of the Bronze Age cooled, they left behind a world forever changed, and a mystery that continues to whisper its siren song across 3,000 years, challenging us to find an answer that may be, like the sea itself, ultimately unknowable. This concludes our story of the Sea Peoples, the shadow from the deep that shattered an age. We hope this journey into one of history's greatest enigmas has captivated you. If you wish to explore more lost civilizations and forgotten truths, the story does not have to end here. Subscribe to Historical Truth to join us on our next investigation into the echoes of the past.